A cop on patrol hears a faint cry from a dumpster and finds newborn twins barely alive, discarded like trash. He saves them, vowing to protect them, but the system swallows them whole. They vanish without a trace. Years later, his phone rings. A woman's voice trembles. "Are you the cop who saved me?" What happened to those twins? And why is she calling now? The truth will shatter everything and send him on a race against time he never saw coming. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The night air bit through Tom Grayson's uniform as he guided his patrol car down another empty street. Bridgeport's broken streetlights cast strange shadows on the crumbling buildings, their windows dark and hollow like empty eyes. He lifted his thermos of coffee to his lips, grimacing at the bitter taste that had gone cold hours ago. The familiar scent of stale coffee and vinyl seats filled the car's interior, a reminder of countless nights just like this one. 25 years on the force, and now here he was, working part-time patrols in his retirement. The radio crackled with routine chatter, a domestic dispute 3 blocks over, already handled. A drunk outside Murphy's bar, sleeping it off in a squad car. A shoplifting incident at the 24-hour convenience store, resolved without arrest. The usual symphony of a city slowly dying, each call another note in its mournful tune. Tom's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening against the worn leather. The dashboard clock blinked 11:57 p.m., its red digits casting a faint glow across his face. Something felt off tonight. He'd learned to trust that feeling in his gut, the one that had saved his life more times than he could count. It was like a sixth sense, honed by years of walking beats and chasing down leads. As he turned down Mason Street past the abandoned liquor store with its faded advertisements and broken neon sign, a sound caught his attention. Faint, almost lost in the whistle of the winter wind that rattled loose pieces of siding. He slowed the car, rolling down his window despite the cold that immediately stung his cheeks. There it was again, a weak cry that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, something between a whimper and a moan. Tom pulled over, the cruiser's headlights illuminating patches of black ice on the sidewalk like scattered mirrors. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, his boots crunching on frozen gravel. The alley beside the liquor store was a narrow canyon of brick and shadow, lined with overflowing dumpsters and scattered debris. Old newspapers skittered across the ground like urban tumbleweeds. "Hello?" His voice echoed off the walls, bouncing between the buildings like a pinball. No response, just another of those strange, mewling cries. Probably just another stray cat, he thought. But something pushed him forward, an instinct he couldn't ignore. The smell hit him first. Rotting garbage, wet cardboard, and something else. Something that made his stomach turn. Something organic and wrong. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on a large dumpster. The cry came again, weaker this time, barely more than a whisper on the wind. Tom approached carefully, years of training keeping him alert for any movement in the shadows. His free hand rested instinctively on his holstered weapon as he peered over the edge of the dumpster, sweeping his light across piles of garbage bags and discarded boxes. Then he saw them, 2 tiny feet pale as moonlight sticking out from beneath a torn garbage bag. The sight stopped his breath in his throat. "Dear God," he whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached in, throwing aside bags and debris with trembling hands. What he found made his blood run cold, freezing him more thoroughly than the winter night ever could. 2 newborn babies, wrapped in dirty rags, lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of their tiny chests. Their skin was ice cold to the touch, their faces impossibly small and tinged with blue. They were thin, too thin, their bodies barely larger than his forearm. Dark wisps of hair clung to their heads like damp feathers. Tom didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his jacket, wrapping it around the twins as he cradled them against his chest. Their bodies were like ice, barely moving, barely breathing. His hands shook as he reached for his radio, fumbling with the button in his haste. "Dispatch!" His voice cracked with urgency, echoing in the narrow alley. "This is Officer Grayson. I need an ambulance at 1242 Mason Street behind the old liquor store. I've got 2 newborns here, barely breathing. They're hypothermic. I repeat, this is an emergency." The dispatcher's voice came back immediately, professional and calm, but Tom barely heard the response over the sound of his own racing heart. He held the twins closer, trying to share what warmth he could. Their breathing was so faint he could barely feel it, like the flutter of butterfly wings against his chest. "Hold on, little ones," he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "Help is coming. Just hold on." He rocked gently back and forth, an instinctive motion he didn't even realize he was making. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. Tom stood there in the alley, protecting the tiny lives in his arms, praying the ambulance would arrive in time. The red and blue lights began to paint the walls around him, a kaleidoscope of hope in the darkness. The ambulance's siren wailed through the frozen night as Tom held onto the tiny hand of one of the twins. His weathered fingers dwarfed her delicate ones, and he could feel each faint pulse beneath paper-thin skin, fragile as a butterfly's wing. The ambulance hit a pothole and Tom's heart jumped into his throat, his grip instinctively tightening ever so slightly. "Please, God, let them make it," he whispered, surprising himself. In 25 years of police work, he'd never once prayed. But tonight was different. These little lives felt too precious, too fragile to lose. Something about their innocence struck a chord deep within him that he couldn't explain. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency in the cramped space, their faces etched with focused determination. One wrapped the babies in silver thermal blankets, while another checked vital signs and adjusted oxygen masks that seemed too big for their tiny faces. The heart monitor beeped irregularly, each unsteady sound making Tom's stomach clench with renewed worry. "Temperature's still dropping," one paramedic called out, his voice tight with urgency. "Push warm fluids. We need to get ahead of this." Tom watched helplessly as they worked, feeling more powerless than he had in years. The ambulance's red lights flashed through the windows, painting everything in surreal bursts of crimson that made the scene feel almost dreamlike. Every second felt like an hour, each moment stretching endlessly as they raced against time. They burst through the emergency room doors at Ridgeport General, where Dr. Evelyn Carter was already waiting, her expression radiating calm competence. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her face set with determination as she ran alongside the gurney, her shoes squeaking against the polished floor. "What do we have?" she demanded, her experienced hands already examining the first twin, moving with quick precision. "Newborns female found in a dumpster, severe hypothermia, possible exposure of 2 to 3 hours, respiratory distress in both patients," the paramedic reported rapidly, barely pausing for breath. Tom followed them into the trauma room, his heart pounding against his ribs. The medical team swarmed around the twins like a well-choreographed dance, each person knowing exactly where to be and what to do. Nurse Hannah Ruiz called out vital signs while Dr. Carter barked orders, her voice steady but urgent, cutting through the controlled chaos. "They're severely hypothermic," Dr. Carter announced, her hands moving quickly as she assessed both babies. "I need warming blankets and—" She never finished her sentence. The monitor attached to one of the twins suddenly screamed a warning, its harsh sound piercing the air. The tiny girl had stopped breathing, her little chest still beneath the thermal blanket. "No pulse," Nurse Ruiz shouted, already moving into position. Tom felt his knees go weak as he watched Nurse Ruiz begin chest compressions with just 2 fingers on the infant's chest, her movements precise and gentle yet determined. The room spun around him, and memories of other cases, other children he couldn't save, threatened to overwhelm him, pressing in from all sides. "Come on, little one," Dr. Carter urged, her voice tight with concentration as she worked. "Fight for us. You can do this." The seconds ticked by like years. Tom couldn't breathe, couldn't move, rooted to the spot by fear and hope. If these girls died, he knew the guilt would consume him. Even finding them wouldn't be enough. He should have been there sooner, should have heard them earlier, should have somehow known. Then, like a miracle, a tiny gasping sound cut through the tension, soft but unmistakable. The monitor's rhythm steadied, and relief washed over the room in an almost physical wave, leaving everyone weak-kneed and grateful. "She's back," Dr. Carter announced, allowing herself a small smile that reached her tired eyes. Let's get them both to the NICU stat. I want continuous monitoring. Tom watched as they transferred the twins to incubators, their tiny bodies finally starting to pink up under the warming lights, replacing the terrifying bluish tinge. The medical team wheeled them toward the neonatal intensive care unit, and Tom followed, his legs moving automatically, drawn by an invisible thread he couldn't explain. Through the NICU's glass windows, he watched the nurses settle the twins into their temporary homes, connecting monitors and adjusting equipment with gentle efficiency. Despite his exhaustion, despite the late hour and the bone-deep weariness that threatened to overwhelm him, he couldn't bring himself to leave. He stood there, one hand pressed against the cold glass, and whispered, "You made it. Now, I'll make sure you're safe." The promise felt like a sacred vow, one he knew would change his life forever. Tom jerked awake in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his neck stiff and his lower back screaming in protest. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow across the sterile room. His mouth felt dry, and the remnants of bad coffee lingered on his tongue, mixing with the metallic taste of exhaustion. A gentle hand touched his shoulder. He looked up to see Nurse Hannah's kind face, her eyes crinkling with compassion behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "They're stable," she said softly. The words washed over him like a warm wave, releasing a tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Both twins had made it through the night. Tom ran a hand over his stubbled face, trying to shake off his exhaustion. The past 48 hours felt like a blur of sirens, doctors' voices, and tiny whimpers. But before he could fully process this good news, the sharp click of heels against linoleum caught his attention. A woman in a neat gray blazer strode into the room, her expression professionally neutral. She carried a leather briefcase and a stack of papers, her whole demeanor radiating efficiency and detachment. "Officer Grayson, I'm Anna Whitmore from Child Protective Services." Her voice was clipped and businesslike, each word precise as a knife edge. "I'm the senior social worker assigned to this case." Tom stood up, ignoring his protesting muscles and the way his joints creaked from sleeping in the chair. "How long until we find their mother?" Anna's lips tightened into a thin line. "That's not your concern anymore, officer. The department will handle the investigation. The infants will be placed in foster care as soon as they're medically cleared." "Now wait a minute," Tom said, taking a step forward, his protective instincts flaring. "I found these girls. I need to know they'll be safe." "With all due respect, your involvement ended when you brought them to the hospital." Anna shuffled through her papers with practiced efficiency. "This is now a CPS matter." "At least keep me updated on their progress," Tom insisted, his voice taking on a pleading edge. "I can help with the investigation." "That would be against protocol." Anna's voice left no room for argument, cold as winter frost. "I understand you feel connected to these children, but there are procedures we must follow." Over the next 2 weeks, Tom called the social services office daily, each rejection harder than the last. Each time, he was met with the same response: "We cannot discuss ongoing cases." He visited the hospital, but the twins had been moved. No one could tell him where. He filed paperwork requesting updates on the case, but his requests disappeared into bureaucratic limbo like stones dropped in a deep well. Then one morning, desperate for answers, Tom went directly to the CPS office. The clerk typed on her computer, her frown deepening with each keystroke. "I'm sorry, sir, we have no record of twin girls being found on December 22nd. Tom's blood ran cold, a chill that reached deep into his bones. "That's impossible. Check again." The clerk shook her head, avoiding his eyes. "There's nothing here. No case file, no placement records." Tom stood in the empty hospital room later that day, staring at the cribs where the twins had fought for their lives. The memory of their tiny hands gripping his fingers felt burned into his skin, a phantom touch he knew would haunt him. His fists clenched at his sides. "I won't forget you," he whispered to the empty room, his voice rough with emotion and promise. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting shadows across the vacant cribs. The antiseptic smell of the hospital seemed to mock the absence of the 2 tiny lives that had touched his heart just days ago, leaving behind only questions and an ache that settled deep in his chest. Tom sat in his worn leather armchair, the evening light casting long shadows across his living room. At 79, his joints ached more than ever, especially in the damp winter weather, but his mind remained sharp as a tack. Scattered around him were old case files, yellowed newspaper clippings, and a notebook filled with his meticulous handwriting, each page a testament to years of relentless searching. His fingers traced the faded ink on the notebook's pages, feeling every indent his pen had made. December 22nd, the date was burned into his memory like a brand. The details of that frigid night had never left him, the weak cries that pierced his soul, the tiny feet poking out of the garbage bags, the desperate race through icy streets to save 2 precious lives. Empty coffee cups and half-eaten meals cluttered his coffee table, evidence of his ongoing obsession. The walls were lined with photos from his years on the force, certificates of commendation that had lost their shine, and one particular newspaper clipping about abandoned twin girls that he'd never been able to take down, though its edges had grown ragged with time. 22 years, he muttered to himself, closing the notebook with trembling fingers. 22 years of dead ends and broken promises. The room had grown darker, but he didn't bother turning on the lights. The street lamp outside cast an orange glow through his window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. His retirement should have been peaceful, filled with fishing trips and grandchildren's visits, but the mystery of those twins haunted his dreams, turning rest into restlessness. The sudden ring of his phone cut through the silence like a knife, making him jump in his seat. He reached for the receiver, his movements slower than they used to be, arthritis making his fingers stiff and clumsy. "Hello?" His voice was gruff from disuse, scratchy like old sandpaper. There was a pause, heavy with possibility, then a woman's voice came through, trembling slightly. "Are you the cop who saved me?" Tom's hand tightened on the receiver until his knuckles turned white. His heart, which had been beating steadily for 79 years, seemed to skip several beats at once. He sat up straighter, every nerve suddenly alert, every sense heightened. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter this moment. The silence on the other end stretched out, filled only by the sound of someone breathing. Tom could hear traffic in the background, a distant siren, the hum of city life, sounds that seemed both familiar and impossibly far away. Then the voice returned, stronger but still shaking with emotion. "I'm Danielle, one of the twins you found that night." Tom's free hand gripped the arm of his chair, his fingers digging into the worn leather. The room seemed to spin around him like a carousel gone wild. After all these years of searching, of hitting walls, of being told to let it go, of watching leads turn to dust, here was a voice from the past, speaking directly to him, making time collapse. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The notebook slipped from his lap, landing on the floor with a soft thud. Pages of notes, leads that went nowhere, theories that died on the vine, all of it scattered across his feet like fallen leaves. His chest felt tight, and he forced himself to take deep breaths, counting them like he used to teach rookie cops to do in tense situations. This moment, this call, it was everything he'd hoped for and feared for over 2 decades. The twin girls had never been just another case to file away and forget. They had been his last case, the one that got away, the one that made him question everything he thought he knew about the system he'd served for so long. "Are you still there?" Danielle's voice came through again, uncertain, like a child testing thin ice. Tom's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his temples, each beat a reminder that this was real, not another dream that would fade with morning light. The past wasn't just memories anymore. It was alive, breathing, speaking to him through his phone. Everything he thought was lost, every question that had plagued him for 22 years, was suddenly within reach, waiting to be grasped. Tom's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white, the plastic casing creaking under the pressure. His throat felt dry as sandpaper, and his heart hammered against his ribs. Danielle? He managed to croak out, hardly believing he was speaking that name aloud after so many years. The line crackled with static, filling the heavy silence between them. He heard a deep, shaky breath on the other end, followed by a slight sniffle. Yes, I'm one of the twins you saved, the one with the birthmark on her ankle. Tom sank deeper into his worn leather armchair, his free hand clutching the armrest until the stuffing compressed beneath his fingers. The room seemed to spin around him, family photos on the walls blurring into meaningless shapes. 22 years of searching, of wondering, of guilt and sleepless nights. And now here she was, her voice breaking through the void like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. Tom's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself, fighting against the wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. I never stopped looking for you both. Not for a single day. I know. Danielle's voice was urgent, tinged with desperation and exhaustion. I found the articles, the inquiries you filed, all those missing persons reports. That's how I tracked you down. But, Officer Grayson, Tom, I need your help. My sister Lena, she's missing. Again. Tom's heart skipped a beat, his mouth going even drier. Missing? The word hung in the air like a death knell. 2 weeks ago, we were separated in foster care when we were 3. Danielle's words tumbled out rapidly now, as if she'd been holding them back for too long, like a dam finally breaking. Different homes, different cities. I found her again last year, but she wasn't doing well. Drugs, bad people, you know how it goes. And now she's gone. The police won't help. They say she's probably just another runaway. But I know something's wrong, I can feel it. Twin thing, maybe. Tom reached for his notebook with trembling hands, his police instincts kicking in despite his age and retirement. He fumbled for a pen in his desk drawer, knocking over a cup of cold coffee in his haste. The system had failed them, twice. First as babies, then by tearing them apart. His jaw clenched at the thought, old anger rising like bile in his throat. The hospital records led me to you, Danielle continued, her voice growing smaller, more vulnerable. You were the only one who ever really tried to help us. Please, I don't know who else to turn to. Everyone else just sees her as another statistic. Tom looked at the wall of evidence he'd collected over the years. Yellowed newspaper clippings, dead-end leads, notes that led nowhere, photographs of 2 identical baby girls in hospital bassinets. Now, one of his ghosts had a voice, was asking for his help. He thought of those tiny feet in the dumpster, of the promise he'd made in that hospital room while standing over their incubators. Never again, he'd sworn. Never again would they be alone. He exhaled slowly, his voice finding its strength, its purpose. Tell me everything you know. Don't leave out a single detail. The bell above the diner door chimed as Tom stepped inside. The smell of burnt coffee and greasy food hit him immediately, mingling with the lingering scent of yesterday's bacon. His eyes swept across the worn booths, past the handful of late-night truckers nursing their coffees until they landed on a lone figure in the corner. Danielle sat hunched over, her fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the scratched tabletop. Her dark hoodie had seen better days, the cuffs frayed and the zipper missing its pull tab, and the side of her head was shaved, revealing a small scar near her temple. She looked up as Tom approached, her eyes sharp and wary beneath strands of unwashed hair. You're really him, she said quietly as Tom slid into the booth across from her. The vinyl seat crackled under his weight, a spring poking through the torn upholstery. Tom nodded, studying her face. She was tough. That much was clear from her rigid posture and the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, marking all the exits. But beneath that hardened exterior, he could see exhaustion, pain, the kind that settled deep in your bones and never really left. A waitress appeared with a pot of coffee, her name tag crooked and her smile tired. Neither of them touched their cups after she filled them, the steam rising between them like a barrier. We got separated when we were 3, Danielle began, her voice low and controlled, though her fingers picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. The system split us up. They told me Lena got adopted by some nice family in Connecticut. She let out a bitter laugh that held no humor. It was all lies. Tom's stomach twisted. What happened? Foster homes, lots of them. Danielle's fingers curled into fists on the table, her knuckles white. Some were okay, most weren't. I learned pretty quick how to take care of myself. She touched the scar on her temple absently, a gesture that seemed unconscious. Spent years thinking Lena was living some perfect life somewhere. Then 5 years ago, I found her. The guilt hit Tom like a physical blow, making his chest tighten. He should have fought harder to keep track of them. Should have done more. She wasn't in Connecticut, he asked, already dreading the answer. Danielle shook her head, swallowing hard. She was right here in Ridgeport, living on the streets, hooked on whatever she could get her hands on. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the pain beneath her tough exterior. I got her clean, found her a place to stay, a job at the grocery store. She was doing better, really better. Then 2 weeks ago, she trailed off, reaching into her pocket. Tom watched as she pulled out a worn photograph and slid it across the table. He picked it up with trembling fingers, noting the creased corners and the way it had been folded and unfolded countless times. The woman in the photo had Danielle's features, but softer, more vulnerable. Her eyes held a haunted look that made his heart ache, though there was a glimmer of hope in her slight smile. This was Lena, the tiny baby he'd pulled from that dumpster, now lost again. The cops won't help, Danielle said, anger and frustration seeping into her words. They took one look at her record and wrote her off as just another junkie who probably relapsed and ran, like she was nothing. Tom set the photo down carefully. But you don't think that's what happened? No. Danielle's voice was firm, her jaw set with determination. She was clean. She was trying. Something happened to her, and I need to find out what. The Starlight Motel's neon sign buzzed and flickered against the gray afternoon sky, casting an intermittent pink glow on the puddles below. Tom pulled his old sedan into the cracked parking lot, the car's suspension groaning over the potholes. Beside him, Danielle sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white with tension. This is where she was staying? Tom asked, eyeing the dilapidated 2-story building. Paint peeled from the walls like dead skin, and several windows were covered with cardboard. A rusty shopping cart lay abandoned near the stairs, filled with empty bottles. Yeah, Danielle replied, her voice tight. It was all she could afford. She said it wasn't great, but at least the heat worked most days. They walked into the office, a cramped space that smelled of cigarettes and mildew. A small TV mounted in the corner played static-filled daytime television. The manager barely glanced up from his newspaper, his coffee-stained undershirt stretching across his belly. Need a room? He grumbled, folding down one corner of his paper. Tom placed his retired police badge on the counter. We're looking for information about Lena Parker. The manager's weathered face showed no interest. His yellowed fingers drummed against the desk. Yeah, she stayed here. Room 115, paid weekly, kept to herself. Quiet one, that girl. When did you last see her? Danielle pressed, leaning forward, her eyes searching the man's face for any sign of deception. He shrugged. Couple weeks ago. One night she was here, next morning she wasn't. Left her stuff behind too. Meant to clean it out, but hadn't gotten around to it. We need to see that room, Tom said firmly, his hand still resting near his badge. The manager tossed them a key without argument, the metal scratched and worn. Whatever, just don't make a mess. More than it already is, anyway. Room 115 was at the far end of the building, past a broken ice machine and a dented vending machine that hummed loudly. The key stuck in the lock, requiring several tries before the door creaked open. The smell hit them first, stale air and something metallic that made Tom's stomach clench. Oh God, Danielle whispered, her hand covering her mouth. The room was chaos. Drawers hung open, their contents scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The blankets had been ripped from the bed, and empty fast food containers littered every surface. A broken lamp lay in pieces by the bathroom door. But what caught Tom's eye was the bedsheet. Dark stains spread across the white fabric like spilled ink, telling a story he didn't want to read. Danielle moved through the room, her movements becoming more frantic. This isn't like her. She wouldn't just leave her things. She picked up a torn shirt, then froze. Tom. He followed her gaze to the bed. Kneeling down, he reached underneath and pulled out a phone with a shattered screen, its case covered in dust. "That's Lena's," Danielle said, her voice breaking. She always had this stupid rainbow sticker on the case. Said it reminded her of better days. Her fingers traced the cracked plastic, trembling slightly. Tom examined the bloodstains more closely, his old investigative instincts kicking in. The pattern suggested a struggle. Someone had fought back hard. He looked at Danielle, whose face had gone pale, her freckles standing out against her bloodless skin. "She didn't leave on her own," he said quietly, the words hanging heavy in the musty air. Rain drummed steadily against the windshield of Tom's car, creating a haunting rhythm in the early morning silence. The wipers squeaked back and forth, fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Danielle sat in the passenger seat, turning Lena's broken phone over and over in her trembling hands. The cracked screen caught what little light filtered through the clouds, reflecting like shattered hopes. Tom watched her carefully, noting how her shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible weight. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed sleepless nights spent worrying. The foster home they were parked in front of looked ordinary enough. A two-story house with faded blue paint and white trim, its windows dark and uninviting. But something about it made his skin crawl, stirring memories of cases he'd rather forget. "Danielle," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "I need to ask you something. Is there anyone specific who might want to hurt Lena? Anyone from your past?" She stopped fidgeting with the phone. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped it tighter, the plastic case creaking under the pressure. Several long seconds passed before she spoke, her voice barely audible above the rain's persistent patter. "The man who raised me," she started, then stopped, swallowing hard. Her fingers traced the edge of the phone nervously. "He's the same one who left us in that dumpster." Tom felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The air seemed to leave his lungs all at once. "What? You mean—" "Yeah." Danielle's eyes remained fixed on the phone, as if it held answers to questions she was afraid to ask. "The person who threw us away like garbage ended up being my foster father. I didn't know until I turned 18 and got access to my records. The truth was there in black and white, mocking me." "My God," Tom whispered, his mind reeling as pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicked into place. "The man who abandoned you in that dumpster actually raised you?" Danielle nodded slowly, a single tear rolling down her cheek and dropping onto the phone's screen. "And now, I think he found Lena." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. The implications hit Tom like a tidal wave, making his stomach churn. This wasn't just about finding a missing person anymore. They were dealing with someone capable of leaving newborn babies to die, someone who had somehow manipulated the system to get one of those babies back under his control. The depth of such calculated evil made his blood run cold. "He's a monster," Tom said, his jaw clenching as years of police instincts screamed warnings in his head. "A predator who's been hiding in plain sight all these years." "If Lena is dead," Danielle's voice cracked as she turned to face him, her eyes swimming with a mix of grief and determination. "I need you to help me find the man who did it." The abandoned foster home loomed before them like a forgotten ghost, its weathered boards and broken windows telling stories of neglect. Thick vines crept up the sides of the building, nature slowly reclaiming what humans had left behind. Tom pulled up to the curb, killing the engine. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the soft patter of rain against the windshield and the distant rumble of thunder. Danielle sat rigid in the passenger seat, clutching Lena's broken phone like it was her last lifeline. Her knuckles were white from gripping it too hard, the cracked screen reflecting the gray light of the stormy day. She stared at the building through the rain-streaked window, her jaw clenched tight enough to make her temples throb. "I lived here for 2 years," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, thick with memories she'd tried to bury. "I hated every second of it. The walls felt like they were closing in on me every night." Tom noticed how her breathing had quickened, how her shoulders tensed as if bracing for a blow. Goosebumps raised on her arms, and she unconsciously leaned away from the building. The house seemed to loom larger as they approached, its boarded windows like dead eyes staring back at them, challenging their presence. They found a loose board at the back of the house, partially hidden behind overgrown bushes. Tom pulled it free with a grunt, creating just enough space for them to squeeze through. The musty smell of decay hit them immediately. Wet wood, mold, and years of abandonment mixed with the sharp tang of rust and something else, something darker. Their footsteps echoed on the rotting floorboards, each step accompanied by an ominous creak. Broken glass crunched beneath their feet like tiny wind chimes. Old toys lay scattered about like forgotten memories. A one-armed doll with haunting glass eyes, a toy car missing its wheels and covered in cobwebs, a teddy bear with its stuffing spilling out like pale entrails. Danielle moved through the rooms like a ghost herself, her fingers trailing along peeling wallpaper that curled away from the walls like dead skin. Crude graffiti covered the walls, angry words and symbols sprayed in various colors, some fresh enough that the paint smell still lingered. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, her hand gripping the banister, which wobbled dangerously under her touch. "Lena's room was upstairs," she said, her voice echoing in the empty space. "Second door on the right. We used to sneak into each other's rooms at night when the nightmares got too bad." The stairs creaked ominously as they climbed, each step a precarious gamble. The second floor was darker, shadows stretching across the hallway like grasping fingers. Water damage had left dark stains on the ceiling that looked almost like faces, and pieces of plaster littered the floor like broken bones. Lena's old room was small with a single window that let in weak, gray light through a spider's web of cracks. An iron bed frame stood against one wall, its mattress long gone, springs rusted, and reaching up like desperate hands. Danielle walked to the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in, her eyes glazed with unshed tears. Tom's trained eye caught something, a floorboard that didn't quite match the others, its grain running perpendicular to its neighbors. He knelt down, running his fingers along the edge, feeling years of use in its worn surface. It came loose easily, as if it had been removed many times before, revealing a dark space beneath. In the space beneath, they found a notebook, its spiral binding rusted and bent. Its pages were yellowed and water-stained, the cover worn smooth from handling, like worry stone. Danielle opened it with trembling fingers, revealing page after page of shaky handwriting, some entries so hard-pressed into the paper they'd left impressions on multiple pages. Tom watched as she flipped through it, her expression growing more troubled with each page, her face draining of color. When she reached the last entry, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The words were there in faded ink, written with such force the pen had torn the paper. "Some girls aren't meant to be found." Danielle's voice quivered as she whispered, her words hanging in the stale air like cobwebs. She knew something, and whatever it was, it terrified her. Her hands shook as she clutched the notebook to her chest as if trying to absorb its secrets through her skin. The hallway reeked of stale cigarettes and despair as Tom approached apartment 4C. Paint peeled from the walls like dead skin, and a flickering fluorescent light cast sickly shadows, giving the space an eerie, neglected feel. Danielle hung back, her shoulders tense, her eyes scanning the grimy corridor with a mix of caution and disgust. Tom's knuckles rapped against the door, the sharp sound echoing through the empty corridor like a gunshot. For a moment, there was silence. Then shuffling footsteps approached from inside, slow and hesitant. A chain slid back and the door opened a crack, revealing a thin face with bloodshot eyes. Curtis Malone, former foster care worker, looked like he hadn't slept in days. His t-shirt was stained with old food and sweat, and his hands trembled slightly, betraying his nervousness. "What do you want?" His voice was hoarse, scratchy from too many cigarettes and too little sleep. "We need to talk about Lena Parker," Tom said firmly, his voice steady and unyielding. Curtis's eyes widened in recognition and fear. He tried to slam the door, but Tom was faster, wedging his foot in the gap to prevent it from closing. "Lena is missing," You know something, Tom insisted, his voice a low growl. After a tense moment, Curtis stepped back, letting them enter. The apartment was a mess. Empty beer cans and overflowing ashtrays littered the coffee table, and fast food containers were scattered across every surface. The air was thick with the smell of cigarettes and old grease. Curtis paced nervously, glancing at the windows as if expecting someone to be watching from the shadows. I shouldn't be talking about this, he muttered, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. It's not safe. Safe from what? Tom pressed, moving closer, his eyes locked onto Curtis's face. What do you know about Lena? Curtis took a long drag, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling, his eyes darting around the room. She was being watched, for weeks before she disappeared. Danielle stepped forward, her voice tight with anger and fear. Watched by who? She demanded, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. A man. Curtis wouldn't meet their eyes, his gaze fixed on the floor. I saw him a few times, hanging around where she lived. She was scared of him, really scared. Would cross the street if she saw anyone who looked like him. Tom's patience was wearing thin, his voice growing sterner. Who was he? Give us a name. Curtis laughed, but there was no humor in it, only a bitter resignation. You already know who it is. He crushed out his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray, adding quietly, Both of you do. The words hung in the air like poison, heavy and oppressive. Danielle's face went pale and her hands began to tremble. I know who it is, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know who took her. Tom watched the color drain from her face, understanding dawning in his chest like a cold, hard weight. The monster from their past had returned, and this time, he wasn't hiding in shadows. He was out in the open, a threat they couldn't ignore. He found her, Danielle said, her words barely audible, her voice filled with a mix of fear and determination. He finally found her. Curtis nodded slowly, his eyes darting between them, the truth laid bare. There was no taking it back now, no hiding from the past. They had to face it head on. The neon beer signs cast a sickly glow through the smoky air as Tom and Danielle pushed through the heavy wooden door of O'Malley's bar. The floor was sticky with decades of spilled drinks, and the morning regulars hunched over their glasses like gargoyles, their weathered faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights above the pool table. Behind the scratched wooden bar, a heavy-set man with graying stubble looked up from wiping glasses with a dingy cloth. His eyes narrowed as they approached, suspicion etched deep in the lines around his mouth. We don't do cops in here, he growled, tossing his rag aside with obvious distaste. I'm not here as a cop, Tom said quietly, sliding onto a bar stool that creaked under his weight. We're looking for someone. Danielle pulled out a photo of Lena and placed it on the bar, her hand trembling slightly. The bartender glanced at it, his expression unchanging as his thick fingers traced the edge of the photograph. That's Lena, he said finally, his voice softening just a fraction. Worked here for a few months. Quiet girl, kept to herself mostly. Good worker, though. Never gave me any trouble with the customers. When was the last time you saw her? Danielle's voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion she was trying so hard to contain. The bartender, his name tag read Mike, scratched his chin, leaving a streak of moisture from his hands. About 2 weeks ago. Weird night, that was. She was working her usual shift, nothing unusual. Then suddenly it was like she saw a ghost. Went pale as paper, grabbed her stuff and ran out the back door. Never saw her again. Left her last paycheck and everything. Tom leaned forward, his elbows resting on the sticky surface. You have security cameras? Mike scowled, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. Look, I don't want any trouble. Please, Danielle interrupted, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She's my sister. Something in her voice must have reached him, cutting through years of practiced indifference. Mike sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging. Fine. Give me a minute. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a battered laptop. The footage was grainy and dark, but they could make out Lena wiping down tables, her movements quick and efficient. She looked nervous, kept glancing over her shoulder like a spooked animal. There, Mike pointed, tapping the screen with a thick finger. That's when it happened. On screen, Lena suddenly froze, the cleaning rag dropping from her hand, her face drained of color. She grabbed her bag from behind the bar and practically ran toward the back exit, knocking over a chair in her haste. As she pushed through the door, a figure stepped into frame. The image was blurry, but something about the way the person moved, the set of their shoulders, the confident stride. Tom felt his stomach clench, a cold feeling of recognition washing over him. He'd seen that walk, that posture before, years ago. But where? The memory danced just beyond his grasp, taunting him. "Can you enhance this?" he asked, knowing it was a long shot. Mike shook his head, closing the laptop. "That's as good as it gets. System's old." Tom stared at the now dark screen, willing his memory to click into place. The answer was there, just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue. "I've seen that face before," he muttered, his fists clenching on the sticky bar top until his knuckles turned white. Rain drummed against the windshield as Danielle guided the car through Ridgeport's dimly lit streets. Her knuckles were white against the steering wheel, jaw clenched tight. The wipers squeaked back and forth, fighting against the downpour that turned the world beyond the glass into a blur of neon signs and streetlights. "She's out here somewhere, I know it." Danielle's voice was rough with exhaustion and worry. Her eyes burned from hours of searching. Tom nodded, his eyes scanning the sidewalks where huddled figures sought shelter under building overhangs and doorways. They pulled up near Carter Street, where groups of homeless people often gathered. The area was known for its abandoned storefronts and makeshift shelters. A teenager in a ratty blue hoodie huddled beneath a store awning, clutching a cardboard sign that was slowly dissolving in the rain. Tom recognized him from his patrols. Jimmy, one of the regulars who'd been on the street since he was 14. "Wait here," Tom told Danielle, but she was already unbuckling her seatbelt, the click echoing in the car's interior. "No way, she's my sister." Her tone left no room for argument. They approached Jimmy together, rainwater soaking through their jackets and seeping into their shoes. The boy looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes when he saw Tom. His face was pale and drawn, marked by too many nights in the cold. "Hey, Officer Grayson." Jimmy's teeth chattered from the cold, his thin hoodie offering little protection against the weather. Tom pulled out Lena's photo, shielding it from the rain with his body. "Have you seen this woman recently?" Jimmy's eyes widened, a flash of concern crossing his face. "Yeah, that's Lena. She used to give me food sometimes, even when she didn't have much herself. Haven't seen her in a while, though." Danielle stepped forward, her voice urgent, almost desperate. "When was the last time you saw her?" "Maybe 2 weeks ago." Jimmy wrapped his arms around himself, shifting from foot to stay warm. "She was acting weird, real jumpy, you know. Said someone was watching her. She seemed different, scared in a way I hadn't seen before." Tom's chest tightened, a familiar dread settling in his stomach. "Did you see anyone following her?" Jimmy nodded slowly, his expression growing serious. "There was this black SUV, tinted windows, fancy looking. It would park across from her motel every night, just sitting there, like it was waiting for something." "What kind of SUV?" Tom's voice was barely a whisper, though his heart pounded loud in his ears. "One of them new Escalades, custom wheels, had a dent in the back bumper right side, chrome trim all around the windows, real expensive looking." Tom's stomach dropped. The description was painfully familiar. He'd seen that vehicle before, parked outside the social services building years ago. The same SUV that belonged to someone who should never have been allowed near foster children. Someone whose presence always meant trouble was close behind. "Jimmy?" Tom's voice was gentle but urgent, fighting to keep his rising anger in check. "Did you ever see who was driving?" "Nah, windows were too dark, but whenever it showed up, Lena would disappear real quick, like she was terrified of it." Jimmy shivered, pulling his hoodie tighter. "Last time I saw her, she was running from it. Haven't seen her since. I've been worried about her." Danielle's hands were shaking and she clenched them into fists to hide it. "We need to find that SUV." Tom reached into his wallet and handed Jimmy some cash. "Get yourself somewhere warm tonight, and if you see that SUV again, I'll call you," Jimmy promised, stuffing the money into his pocket. "Hope you find her. Lena's good people." They hurried back to the car, rain pelting their faces and running down their necks. Tom's mind was racing, connecting dots he should have seen sooner. The SUV, the timing, Lena's fear. It all pointed to one person, a person he'd hoped never to encounter again. As they climbed into the car, Tom gripped the dashboard, his knuckles white. "I know who took her." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, like old failure coming back to haunt him. The black SUV glided through the rain-slicked streets like a phantom, its taillights bleeding red through the darkness. Tom and Danielle followed at a safe distance, their headlights off, the wipers squeaking softly against the drizzle. Every turn felt like a heartbeat, every moment stretching into infinity as they tracked their target through the empty city. "He's slowing down," Tom whispered, leaning forward in his seat, his weathered hands gripping the armrest. The SUV's brake lights flared as it turned into an abandoned warehouse district. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth in the concrete facades. Graffiti-covered walls seemed to glow under the sparse streetlights, their neon colors a stark contrast to the grime and decay. Danielle's hands trembled on the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. "This is it." Her voice barely carried over the patter of rain against the windshield. They watched as the SUV pulled into a crumbling parking lot beside a massive warehouse. Paint peeled from its walls in long strips, and chains hung loose from rusted loading dock doors. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, reaching toward the clouded sky. The vehicle came to a stop, its engine cutting off with a low rumble that echoed in the empty lot. A tall figure emerged from the driver's side, his movements calculated and precise, like a dancer performing a deadly routine. Even from this distance, Tom recognized him immediately: Calvin Briggs. The man had been a foster father for years, always managing to dodge accusations and investigations with a snake's cunning. Tom had suspected him in several trafficking cases, but the evidence always disappeared. Witnesses always went silent, leaving behind nothing but broken lives and haunted eyes. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers dug into the dashboard until her knuckles went white, trembling with suppressed emotion. "That's him," she whispered, voice thick with rage and pain, years of buried memories surging to the surface. "He raised me, and he threw us away like we were nothing." They watched as Briggs looked around, his head turning slowly like a predator scanning for threats, raindrops gleaming on his dark coat. Satisfied he was alone, he pulled something from the SUV and walked toward a side door of the warehouse, his footsteps eerily silent on the wet pavement. Just as he disappeared inside, a sound cut through the night, a muffled scream that made Tom's blood run cold. It was distant but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere inside the building, bouncing off the concrete walls like a trapped bird. "Lena," Danielle breathed, already reaching for her door handle, her whole body coiled like a spring. Tom grabbed her arm, his grip firm but gentle. "Wait," he said firmly, years of police experience evident in his steady tone. "We need to be smart about this. He's dangerous. One wrong move and—" "That's my sister in there," Danielle hissed, but she stayed put, her whole body vibrating with tension, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. Tom pulled his service weapon from its holster, checking it with practiced movements that spoke of years on the force. The weight felt reassuring in his hands, cold and familiar. After all these years, after failing these girls once before, he finally had a chance to make things right, to fulfill an old promise. The warehouse loomed before them, its broken windows like dark eyes watching their approach, decades of secrets hidden behind its walls. Another cry echoed from within, more desperate this time, cutting through the steady drumming of rain. Tom reached for his gun, determination settling over him like armor. "We're going in!" The warehouse door creaked softly as Tom and Danielle slipped inside, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The musty air caught in their throats, mixed with the sharp smell of gasoline and decades of decay. Dust particles danced in the pale beams of light, stirred by their careful movements. "Stay close," Tom whispered, his hand steady on his gun. Danielle nodded, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Rusted metal shelves towered above them like ancient sentinels, while scattered crates created a maze of hiding spots. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, each drop a tiny reminder of how time had eaten away at the building. A phone's glow pierced the darkness ahead. Calvin Briggs emerged from a side room, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete. He held his phone to his ear, speaking in hushed tones, his pristine suit a stark contrast to the decay around him. "Yes, everything's under control," he muttered. "No loose ends." His voice carried that familiar coldness that made Danielle's skin crawl. Danielle's body went rigid. Her fingers curled into fists, and Tom could feel the rage radiating off her. She took a step forward, but Tom's hand caught her arm. The muscles beneath his grip trembled with barely contained fury. "I want to kill him," she whispered, her voice trembling with decades of pain. Her jaw clenched so tight Tom could hear her teeth grinding. "We need Lena first," Tom reminded her firmly, pulling her back behind a stack of crates. The rotting wood pressed against their backs as they hid. They waited until Calvin's footsteps faded before moving toward the room he'd left. A faint whimper echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. The sound made Danielle's heart race, and her breath caught in her throat. The back room was small, lit by a single bare bulb that flickered erratically. What they found inside made Tom's blood run cold. The walls were covered with missing person flyers, all of Lena. Newspaper clippings about the twins' discovery in the dumpster yellowed with age. Photos were everywhere, surveillance shots spanning years. The sheer volume of images spoke to an obsession that had never dimmed. Lena walking to work, Danielle outside her apartment, the twins together at a cafe. Recent photos mixed with older ones, creating a disturbing timeline of obsession. Some pictures were marked with dates and notes in Calvin's precise handwriting. "He's been watching us," Danielle breathed, her voice breaking. "All these years." Her hand reached out to touch one of the photos, then pulled back as if it might burn her. Tom studied the wall of evidence, his stomach churning. Calvin hadn't just abandoned them, he'd been stalking them, documenting their lives like a twisted collector. Among the photos, one stood out. It showed Lena, clearly terrified, dated just 3 days ago. Her face was thin, her eyes haunted, but alive. "She's still alive," Tom said, his voice firm with certainty. His police instincts told him they were close. The flickering light cast shadows across the wall of obsession, each photo telling a story of a predator who had never truly let his prey go. In the distance, another whimper echoed through the warehouse, and both Tom and Danielle turned toward the sound, knowing their search was far from over. The sound carried a desperation that made their hearts ache, a reminder of why they couldn't give up now. The storage room door groaned as Tom pushed it open, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The musty air hit them like a wall, carrying years of neglect and decay. The sight before them made his stomach turn and his heart clench painfully in his chest. Lena lay crumpled against the far wall, her wrists bound with zip ties that had cut into her skin, her clothes dirty and torn beyond recognition. Her dark hair hung in matted strands across her face, and dried blood caked the corner of her mouth, telling a story of violence they'd arrived too late to prevent. Danielle's sharp intake of breath echoed in the small space, bouncing off the walls like a trapped thing. "Oh God, Lena." Her voice cracked with emotion, her hands clenching into tight fists at her sides, knuckles turning white with barely contained rage and grief. Tom quickly scanned the room, his cop instincts kicking in despite his retirement. No windows, one door, concrete walls covered in old water stains and graffiti that spoke of years of abandonment. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting unsteady shadows that danced across their faces like malevolent spirits. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something else. Fear, mixed with the metallic tang of blood and human suffering. Lena's head lolled to the side as her eyes fluttered open, glazed and unfocused like broken glass. Dark circles marked her pale face, and her cheeks were hollow, skin stretched tight over her bones like paper. Tom recognized the signs immediately. She was deep in withdrawal, her body fighting against itself. Her arms showed fresh track marks amid older scars that mapped a history of addiction, and her whole body trembled like a leaf in the wind, each shake seeming to drain what little strength she had left. Danielle rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside her sister, gravel crunching beneath her like broken promises. "Lena? It's me. It's Danielle." Her hands shook as she reached out, desperate to touch her sister, to make sure she was real and not another cruel dream. Lena's cracked lips parted, a thin line of blood trickling down her chin like tears. "He said..." Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse and dehydration, each word seeming to cost her dearly. "He said no one would come. I'm here now, I found you." Danielle's fingers fumbled with the zip ties, but Lena jerked away with surprising strength, pressing herself harder against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. A small whimper escaped her throat, her eyes wide with terror, seeing demons only she could perceive. "Easy," Tom said softly, kneeling beside them on the dirty concrete, his joints protesting the movement. He gently took Lena's wrist, checking her pulse. It was rapid and thready under his fingers, like a trapped bird trying to escape its cage. "She's in bad shape, we have to get her out now." Danielle tried again to reach for her sister, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto her shirt, leaving dark spots like bullet holes. "Lena, please, let me help you." Lena's eyes darted between them, unfocused and afraid, like a wounded animal cornered by predators. Her breathing came in short, sharp gasps that echoed in the small space, each one a battle for air. "He'll come back. He always comes back." Her words slurred together, thick with fear and the fog of withdrawal. Tom pulled out his pocket knife, moving slowly so as not to startle her, every movement measured and deliberate. The blade gleamed in the flickering light like a promise of freedom. "We won't let him hurt you anymore, but we need to move quickly." Just then, heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse outside, the sound bouncing off metal and concrete like thunder. They grew closer, steady and deliberate, like a countdown to disaster. Danielle froze, her face draining of color, leaving her as pale as her sister. Lena began to shake violently, her teeth chattering like castanets in the heavy silence. The door behind them creaked, hinges protesting as it slowly began to open, the sound stretching out like a scream. The storage room door slammed open with a metallic bang that echoed through the dim space. Calvin Briggs filled the doorway, his expensive charcoal suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the grimy, forgotten surroundings. A cold smile played across his face as he surveyed the scene before him, his eyes glinting with predatory satisfaction. Well, look who finally came home," he said, his voice smooth as silk but dripping with venom, each word carefully chosen to wound. Danielle's whole body trembled, her hands clenching into tight fists at her sides. 22 years of pain, rage, and fear exploded in an instant, burning through her veins like acid. With a guttural scream that tore from deep in her chest, she launched herself at Calvin, fists raised. But he was ready, just as he'd always been. He sidestepped her attack with practiced ease, grabbing her arm and throwing her hard against a metal shelf. The impact rattled through the room, sending dust and debris raining down. Tom's gun cleared its holster in one fluid motion, the metal catching what little light filtered through the dirty windows. "It's over, Briggs," he commanded, his voice steady despite the fury burning in his eyes. Calvin laughed, the sound echoing off the concrete walls like broken glass. "Is it?" He turned to Danielle, who was pulling herself up, blood trickling from a fresh cut on her cheek. "You think this is justice? I raised you, Danielle, made you strong. You owe me everything you are." "You threw us away like garbage," Danielle spat, her voice raw with emotion as her hand closed around a rusted pipe lying among the debris. She swung it with all her strength, years of pent-up rage behind the blow, catching Calvin on the side of his head. He stumbled backward, blood streaming from his temple, but that cruel smile never left his face, as if pain was just another game to him. His hand moved slowly, deliberately toward his jacket. Tom saw the motion and fired a warning shot into the ground. The gunshot cracked through the air like thunder, sending small chunks of concrete flying. "Don't," Tom warned, his finger steady on the trigger, his stance unwavering. "Keep those hands where I can see them, or the next one won't be a warning." From her place against the wall, Lena whimpered, pulling weakly at her restraints, the sound small but devastating in the tense atmosphere. The noise seemed to energize Danielle, whose eyes burned with protective rage, her entire body coiled like a spring ready to strike again. Calvin dabbed at his bleeding temple with his expensive sleeve, that unnerving grin still plastered across his face, turning the blood into a grotesque war paint. "You think this is over?" he asked, his voice filled with dark amusement and something deeper, more dangerous. "This is just the beginning." The tension in the room was suffocating, like a physical weight pressing down on all of them, making each breath a struggle. Tom kept his gun trained on Calvin, reading the subtle shifts in the man's posture, knowing this man was far more dangerous than he appeared. 22 years of secrets, pain, and calculated cruelty stood before them, wrapped in an expensive suit and wearing a smile that never reached his cold, dead eyes. The storage room's single bulb cast harsh shadows across Calvin's face as Tom kept his gun steady, positioning himself between the predator and his prey. Sweat trickled down Tom's temple, but his hands remained rock solid, years of police training kicking in. The musty air hung thick with tension, heavy with the scent of rust and decay. Old cardboard boxes lined the walls, their edges softened by time and dampness. "You're done, Briggs." Tom's voice carried the weight of 2 decades of regret and determination. Each word felt like lead in his mouth, bitter with memories of past failures. He could still see the faces of every victim he'd failed to protect from this man. Calvin dabbed at his bleeding lip with his silk handkerchief, looking more annoyed than concerned, as if someone had merely spilled coffee on his shoes. His expensive suit was now stained with dust and blood, but his composure never wavered. A hint of a smirk played at the corner of his mouth, the same smile that had fooled judges and juries for years. "You don't want to do this, old man." Behind Tom, Danielle's knuckles were raw and bloody from where she'd struck Calvin. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths as she gripped the rusted pipe, her whole body trembling with barely contained fury. Tears of rage burned in her eyes, leaving tracks down her dirt-smudged cheeks. On the floor, Lena whimpered softly, her eyes wide with terror, arms wrapped protectively around herself, rocking slightly back and forth. "The system won't keep me locked up," Calvin said, straightening his tie with casual indifference. His fingers moved with practiced precision, as if he were preparing for a business meeting rather than facing down a gun. The diamond ring on his finger caught the light as he adjusted his cuffs. "You know that better than anyone, don't you, Officer Grayson? How many times have you tried to nail me over the years? 5? 6? Danielle's face contorted with rage, her features twisting into something almost feral. Years of bottled-up pain and anger erupted in a single moment. "You monster!" She lunged forward, pipe raised high above her head, ready to strike, her feet scuffing against the concrete floor. "No!" Tom grabbed her arm, pulling her back with enough force to make her stumble. "Not like this." His voice softened slightly, though his eyes never left Calvin. "He's not worth throwing your life away." Calvin's laughter echoed off the warehouse walls, cold and hollow, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "What are you gonna do? Arrest me? We both know how that ends." His eyes gleamed with malice, like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "I own this city. I own them." He gestured toward the twins, his movement deliberately slow and taunting, like a conductor leading a familiar symphony. A metallic click cut through the tension as Calvin's hand moved behind his back, the sound unmistakable to Tom's trained ear. The fluorescent light above flickered once, casting strange shadows across Calvin's face. Tom's reaction was instant. The gunshot cracked like thunder in the enclosed space, sending concrete dust flying where the bullet struck the floor. The echo reverberated through their bones, and somewhere in the distance a car alarm started wailing. "Don't!" Tom's voice was steel, every muscle in his body coiled tight like a spring. "If you so much as blink wrong, I will put you down. Hands where I can see them." His finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the trigger. "Ready." The weight of his service weapon felt familiar, like greeting an old friend. The dim light flickered overhead as Calvin's smirk cut through the tension. His hands rose slowly, deliberately, but his eyes held no fear, only cruel amusement. A chill ran down Danielle's spine as she watched him, her knuckles turning white around the rusted pipe, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The musty warehouse air felt thick with decades of pain and secrets. "Put the cuffs on him," Tom ordered, keeping his gun trained steadily on Calvin. His jaw was set with determination, but Danielle didn't move. Her whole body trembled with decades of buried pain, memories threatening to overwhelm her. "He deserves to die," she whispered, voice cracking like thin ice. "After everything he did, all the lives he destroyed." Tom kept his voice steady, though his heart ached for her. The weight of his own guilt pressed down on him as he watched her struggle. "We do this the right way. If you kill him, he wins. Don't let him take anything more from you." Danielle's eyes never left Calvin's face. Images flashed through her mind like a horror movie she couldn't stop. Nights spent hiding in closets, bruises carefully covered with makeup and lies, her sister's muffled tears, the biting cold of abandonment in that freezing dumpster, the endless years of manipulation and abuse that followed when he took them in, pretending to be their savior while breaking them piece by piece, delighting in their pain. She lifted the pipe higher, muscles tensing beneath her worn jacket. Calvin's smile widened, revealing teeth that gleamed in the dim light. "Go ahead, finish what you started," he taunted, his voice silky smooth and poisonous. "Make yourself just like me." His words dripped with satisfaction, knowing exactly how to push her buttons, playing her like he always had. "You've always had that darkness in you, Danielle. We both know it. You're more like me than you want to admit." Her hands shook violently, the pipe wavering in her grip. One swing. That's all it would take to end this nightmare forever. To silence his voice, to stop the memories, to finally feel safe. Tom stepped closer, his presence steady and warm like a lighthouse in a storm. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, not restraining, just reminding her she wasn't alone anymore, that she had people who truly cared about her now. "You are not him," Tom said softly, his words cutting through the fog of rage and pain. "You never were. You're stronger than this, Danielle." Tears spilled down Danielle's cheeks, cutting trails through the dust on her face. Her chest heaved with sobs she'd held back for too long, years of unshed tears finally breaking free. The pipe slipped from her grasp, hitting the concrete with a hollow clang that echoed through the warehouse like a bell tolling the end of an era. She stared at Calvin through blurry eyes, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not as the monster who had dominated her life, but as a pathetic, broken man who could only feel powerful by hurting others. His own weakness was suddenly so obvious it almost made her laugh. "I'm not like you," she whispered, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And I never will be. You have no power over me anymore." Behind them, Lena let out a small whimper, huddled against the wall. The sound centered Danielle, reminding her what really mattered. Not revenge, but healing. Not the past, but the future they could build together, free from his shadow. Calvin's smirk faltered for the first time, his mask cracking as he watched his control slip away. Danielle straightened her shoulders and turned her back on him, each step away feeling lighter than the last. Red and blue lights pierced the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the warehouse's crumbling exterior. The old building loomed against the night sky like a forgotten giant. Tom's weathered hands shook slightly as he pressed the radio button, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and rage. "Dispatch, this is Officer Grayson. We have a suspect in custody at the old Ridgeport Industrial Complex. Send all available units." Inside, Danielle gently wrapped her arm around Lena's waist, supporting her sister's fragile frame. The musty air hung heavy with decades of abandonment. Lena's skin felt cold, her body trembling with each step, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I've got you," Danielle whispered, fighting back tears as she felt every bone in her sister's too thin frame. "Just lean on me." The wail of approaching sirens grew louder, echoing off the warehouse walls. Calvin stood against the wall, that infuriating smirk still plastered across his face, his expensive suit somehow pristine despite everything. "You really think this changes anything?" he taunted, eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "The system's broken. Always has been." Tom grabbed Calvin's shoulder roughly, shoving him face first against the concrete wall with a satisfying thud. "The only thing broken here is your chance of ever hurting anyone again." His voice carried decades of pent-up anger, rough like gravel. Police cars flooded the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Officers rushed in with weapons drawn, quickly securing the scene, their boots echoing on the concrete floor. 2 officers approached with handcuffs ready, faces grim with determination. "You don't get it, do you?" Calvin laughed as the metal cuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound sharp and final. "I own people, important people. This won't stick." Tom leaned in close, his voice low and dangerous, years of frustration finally finding release. "Oh, you'll be locked up for life. And this time, you won't get out." He watched with satisfaction as officers led Calvin toward a waiting squad car, his smirk finally beginning to fade. Lena's legs buckled and Danielle tightened her grip, her sister's weight feeling like both a burden and a blessing. A detective in plain clothes approached them, his badge glinting in the emergency lights, concern etched on his face. "She needs immediate medical attention," he said, gesturing to an ambulance that had just arrived, its red lights spinning. "We'll take her to Ridgeport General." Paramedics rushed forward with a stretcher, but Lena clung to Danielle, panic flashing in her eyes like a trapped animal. "It's okay," Danielle soothed, stroking her sister's tangled hair. "I'm coming with you. I promise." As they helped Lena onto the stretcher, she turned her head weakly toward Danielle. Her voice was barely a whisper, cracking with emotion, years of pain and loneliness in every word. "I didn't think you'd come." Danielle grabbed her sister's hand, squeezing it gently as tears rolled down her cheeks, leaving tracks in the dust on her face. "I'll never leave you again." Her voice was firm, a promise carved in stone, stronger than any fear or doubt. Never. The steady rhythm of medical monitors filled the quiet hospital room. Fluorescent lights cast a soft glow over Lena's pale face as she lay in the hospital bed, an IV line snaking from her arm. Tom sat in the vinyl chair beside her, his tired eyes never leaving her face, just like that winter night 22 years ago when he first found her. Danielle was curled up awkwardly in another chair, her tough exterior softened by exhaustion. Her chest rose and fell steadily, finally allowing herself to rest after days of desperate searching. The room felt peaceful despite the sterile surroundings. Outside the window, city lights twinkled against the dark sky, a gentle reminder that they were far from the warehouse's horrors. Lena stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Her gaze found Tom, confusion giving way to recognition. "You stayed?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. Tom leaned forward, his weathered face gentle. "I told you I wouldn't leave you again." He meant every word. Lena exhaled shakily, tears gathering in her eyes. She closed them again, but this time it wasn't from fear. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, she felt truly safe. The door opened with a soft click as Dr. Evelyn Carter entered, clipboard in hand. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb Danielle's much-needed rest. The doctor's expression was serious but kind as she checked Lena's vitals. "She'll need extensive rehabilitation," Dr. Carter explained in hushed tones. "The withdrawal symptoms are severe, and the psychological trauma..." She glanced at Tom. "It's going to be a long road." Tom nodded, watching as Danielle stirred awake. She immediately reached for Lena's hand, brushing her sister's tangled hair back with gentle fingers. The tender gesture spoke volumes about their bond, fractured but never truly broken. Lena's eyes opened again, finding her sister's face. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I want to go home." Danielle squeezed her hand, tears falling freely now. "You already are." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. After 22 years of searching, running and fighting, they had finally found their way back to each other. Not just the twins, but Tom too, the unlikely family forged in that winter night so long ago. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows across Lena's hospital room as she jerked awake, her thin body shaking with tremors. Sweat dampened her hospital gown, and her eyes darted wildly around the room. "It's okay, you're safe," Danielle said immediately at her sister's side. Her hand reached for Lena's, but Lena pulled away. "I don't feel safe," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. The next few days blurred together in a haze of pain and fear. Lena's withdrawal symptoms intensified, leaving her writhing in agony. Her muscles seized with cramps, and waves of nausea kept her from eating. But the worst part was the night terrors. "No, please! Don't!" Lena would scream in her sleep, thrashing against invisible enemies. When she woke, confusion clouded her eyes, and she couldn't tell what was real anymore. Tom kept his vigil outside her room each night, his heart breaking at every scream. He'd pace the hallway, feeling helpless, remembering the tiny baby he'd saved from the dumpster all those years ago. Danielle tried everything she could think of. She brought Lena's favorite books, played soft music, and stayed by her side for hours. But nothing seemed to help. "I don't know how to help you," Danielle admitted one afternoon, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Lena's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't understand," she shouted, knocking a cup of water off her bedside table. "You weren't there. You don't know what it was like." The words hit Danielle like a physical blow, but she stood her ground. "Then help me understand." But Lena turned away, shutting down completely. Late one night, when the hospital corridors were quiet except for the squeaking of nurses' shoes, Lena slipped out of her bed. Her legs trembled as she took a few steps toward the door. She made it to the hallway before her knees buckled. Tom, who had been sitting in his usual spot, lunged forward and caught her before she hit the floor. Her body felt fragile in his arms, like a bird with broken wings. "You don't have to fight alone," he whispered, holding her steady. Lena's fingers gripped his arm weakly and tears spilled down her cheeks. "I want to get better," she said, her voice shaking. "I just don't know how." Tom nodded, his eyes gentle. "Then we'll figure it out together." The courtroom's wooden benches creaked as people shifted nervously. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Lena's fingers dug into the edge of her seat, her knuckles white with tension. Beside her, Danielle's presence felt like a shield against the cold smirk Calvin Briggs wore across the room. "The prosecution calls Lena Parker to the stand," the attorney announced, her voice cutting through the whispers. Tom leaned forward in his seat, watching intently from the front row. His weathered face showed concern as Lena hesitated, her body trembling slightly. Calvin's smirk widened, confidence radiating from his orange jumpsuit. He expected her to break just like before. Danielle reached over, squeezing her sister's hand. "You can do this," she whispered, her voice steady and sure. Lena stood slowly, her legs shaking beneath her simple black dress. The walk to the witness stand felt endless. Each step echoed in the hushed courtroom. She raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. The prosecutor approached gently. "Ms. Parker, can you tell us about your relationship with the defendant?" Lena's voice started quiet but grew stronger with each word. She described years of manipulation and abuse, the way Calvin had controlled every aspect of her life, the terror of being hunted when she tried to escape, the addiction he had forced on her to maintain control. "He told me no one would ever believe me," Lena said, her voice clear despite her trembling hands. "He said I was nothing without him." Calvin's smirk began to fade as Lena continued. He tried to catch her eye, to intimidate her like he always had, but something had changed. For the first time, Lena didn't look away. She met his gaze steadily, and he was the one who flinched. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically, past allegations that had been buried, financial records showing his control, the photos and documents from the warehouse proving years of stalking, medical reports detailing Lena's injuries and forced addiction. Calvin's confident facade cracked further with each piece of evidence. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but he barely seemed to hear. His eyes kept returning to Lena, disbelief evident on his face. She wasn't breaking, she wasn't running, she was destroying him with the truth. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully, her expression grave. When she looked up, her eyes were hard. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, this court sentences Calvin Briggs to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck with finality. Lena released a shaky breath, feeling a weight lift from her chest that she'd carried for so long. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Ridgeport Rehabilitation Center, casting warm patterns across the polished floor. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation as families and friends filled the rows of chairs. Paper programs rustled softly, and occasional whispers floated through the air. Lena stood at the front of the room, her hands trembling slightly as they gripped her speech. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and her eyes were clear, a stark contrast to the haunted look they'd held just months ago. She wore a simple blue dress that made her look younger, more like the person she might have been without all the trauma. In the front row, Danielle couldn't stop fidgeting with her sleeve, her eyes never leaving her sister. Tom sat beside her, his weathered face soft with emotion. He'd seen countless graduations during his years as a cop, but none had ever meant this much. The rehab director, Dr. Sarah Martinez, stepped up to the podium. Her voice carried clearly through the room. And now I'd like to call up Lena Parker to share her story. Lena took a deep breath and walked to the podium. Her hands shook as she unfolded her paper, but when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "I am not what happened to me," she began, her words cutting through the silence. "I am what I choose to become." Danielle's breath caught in her throat. Tom reached over and squeezed her hand. "6 months ago, I didn't believe I had a future," Lena continued. "I was lost in darkness, convinced I didn't deserve to be saved." She paused, looking directly at her sister and Tom. "But someone once told me that healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about creating a future worth living for." The room remained silent, hanging on her every word. Some nodded in understanding, others wiped away tears. Warm applause filled the room as Lena finished speaking. Danielle couldn't hold back her tears anymore, wiping them away with the back of her hand. Tom clapped proudly, his eyes shining with emotion. When Lena stepped down from the stage, Danielle rushed forward to meet her. The sisters embraced tightly, years of pain and separation dissolving in that moment. "I made it," Lena whispered into her sister's shoulder. Danielle's voice was thick with emotion as she responded, "I always knew you would." The aroma of roasted turkey and fresh-baked pie filled Tom's modest home. Golden light from the setting sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the dining room. The table, usually empty and quiet, now overflowed with dishes and laughter. Tom stood at the head of the table, carving knife in hand, carefully slicing the perfectly browned turkey. His weathered face creased with joy as he watched Danielle and Lena playfully bicker over dessert. "I called dibs on the biggest slice of pumpkin pie," Danielle insisted, pointing at the freshly baked pie cooling on the counter. Lena rolled her eyes, but her smile was bright. "You always pull the big sister card." The change in Lena was remarkable. Her cheeks had filled out, and healthy color had returned to her face. Her eyes sparkled with life instead of fear. She wore a comfortable sweater, and her hands no longer shook when she reached for her glass. "How's the new job going, sis?" Danielle asked, accepting a plate of turkey from Tom. "Still loving those kindergartners?" Lena's face lit up. "They're amazing. Yesterday, little Tommy drew me a picture of a purple elephant riding a bicycle." She laughed, the sound clear and genuine. "It's on my fridge now." Tom settled into his chair, taking in the scene before him. Just a year ago, he'd been alone in this house, haunted by memories and regrets. Now the walls echoed with warmth and family, something he never thought he'd have again. Danielle raised her glass, her expression growing serious for a moment. "To second chances," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "To second chances," Tom and Lena echoed, clinking their glasses together. As they ate, they shared stories, some from the past year, others from long ago. But unlike before, the painful memories didn't have the same sharp edges. They had become stepping stones rather than stumbling blocks. Tom watched as Lena explained her plans to start taking night classes next semester. Her hands moved animatedly as she talked about becoming a counselor someday, wanting to help other people find their way back from darkness. The evening wrapped around them like a warm blanket, comfortable and safe. Lena reached across the table and took Tom's hand, her expression softening. "I never got to say it before," she said quietly. Tom raised an eyebrow. "Say what?" Lena smiled, squeezing his hand. "Thank you." Tom looked around at his unlikely family, these two strong women who had fought their way back from the edge of despair, and finally felt at peace. The autumn wind whispered through the trees, sending leaves dancing across Tom's front yard. Inside his modest suburban home, shadows stretched across the living room walls as evening settled in. Case files lay scattered on the coffee table, remnants of old investigations that seemed to mirror the current tension in the room. Lena stood by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her reflection showed dark circles under her eyes, evidence of sleepless nights since leaving rehab. She watched the falling leaves with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something else entirely, perhaps memories she couldn't shake. Danielle sat on the worn leather couch, her phone casting a blue glow on her face. Every few seconds, she glanced up at her sister, her fingers drumming restlessly against the armrest. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with unspoken words. Tom observed them both from his favorite armchair, noting how the sisters seemed worlds apart despite being in the same room. He'd seen this building for days, Lena withdrawing further into herself, Danielle growing increasingly frustrated. "You haven't said more than 2 words all day." Danielle finally broke the silence, setting her phone down. "You can't keep shutting us out like this." Lena didn't move, didn't even blink. "I'm fine." "No, you're not fine." Danielle stood up, her voice rising slightly. "You haven't been fine since you got back. Why won't you just talk to me?" Lena's shoulders tensed. "Because you don't get it." She whirled around, her eyes flashing. "You don't understand what it was like. You weren't there." "I wasn't there?" Danielle's voice cracked with emotion. "I was looking for you while you were disappearing. Do you know what that did to me? Every time my phone rang, I thought it was someone telling me they'd found your body." "You think that's the same?" Lena's hands balled into fists. "You have no idea what he did to me, what I had to do to survive." "Then tell me." Danielle stepped closer. "Help me understand." "I can't," Lena screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I can't relive it just because you need to feel better about what happened." Before Danielle could respond, Lena rushed past her and out the front door. The screen door slammed behind her, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Tom found her on the porch steps, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her breath came in short gasps as she tried to control her tears. He lowered himself onto the step beside her, his joints protesting the movement. "Running won't fix it, kid," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. Lena leaned against him, her body trembling. "I don't know how to stop." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the stark interrogation room, casting harsh shadows across Calvin Briggs's face. His orange jumpsuit seemed too bright against the gray walls, his handcuffs clicking against the metal table as he shifted in his chair. Tom sat across from him, his weathered face showing no emotion. "You're looking old, Officer Grayson," Calvin said, his voice carrying that familiar smugness. "Retirement not treating you well?" Tom didn't respond. Instead, he methodically laid out photographs and documents on the table between them. Crime scene photos, hospital records, witness statements, evidence that had been building for decades. "You know what this is?" Tom asked quietly. "This is your legacy, Briggs. Every person you hurt. Every life you destroyed." Calvin's smirk wavered slightly. "Ancient history. You can't prove anything." "Actually, we can." Tom tapped the files. "DNA evidence, financial records, witness testimonies. It's all here. No deals, no loopholes. You're done." Calvin leaned back, trying to maintain his air of confidence. "Those girls will never forget me. I'm in their nightmares, their memories. Every time they close their eyes." "They don't have to forget," Tom cut him off, his voice cold as steel. "They just have to move forward. And they will." without you." For the first time, fear flickered across Calvin's face. His facade cracked just slightly. "You think a cell can hold me?" Calvin's voice raised slightly, desperation creeping in. "I've beaten charges before. I always find a way." "Not this time." Tom's words were quiet but final. "You're looking at life without parole, multiple counts, no chance of appeal." Calvin's smirk finally fell completely. He glanced at the evidence spread before him, then back at Tom. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. "They're healing," Tom continued, gathering the files. "Getting stronger every day. While you—" He stood up, looking down at Calvin. "You'll rot in that cell alone." As Tom walked toward the door, he heard Calvin's breathing quicken. When he glanced back one final time, he saw what he'd been waiting for. Genuine fear in the eyes of a man who had always believed himself untouchable. The marble halls of the Ridgeport courthouse echoed with murmured conversations and shuffling feet. Lena Parker stood outside the heavy wooden doors, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed down her navy blue blazer. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, so different from the worn-out clothes she'd lived in for years. Danielle noticed her sisters shaking hands and stepped closer. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly, squeezing Lena's hand. Lena took a deep breath, drawing strength from her sister's presence. "I know." Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled in notepads, their pens scratching against paper. Police officers lined the walls, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Tom sat in the front row, his face set with quiet determination. When Lena took the stand, the room fell into a heavy silence. She could feel Calvin's eyes on her from across the room, but she refused to meet his gaze. The wooden chair felt hard and uncomfortable beneath her, the microphone too close to her face. The prosecutor, a woman with kind eyes, approached. "Ms. Parker, can you tell us what happened?" Lena's throat felt dry. She glanced at Danielle, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking another deep breath, she began to speak. Her voice wavered at first, but grew stronger with each word. She described the years of manipulation, the constant fear that followed her like a shadow, the nights spent hiding in cheap motels, always looking over her shoulder, the addiction that nearly destroyed her, fueled by desperation to escape her memories. "He told me no one would ever believe me," Lena said, her voice clear despite the tears in her eyes. "He said I was nothing, that I deserved everything that happened to me." As she spoke, Calvin's carefully maintained facade began to crack. His smirk faltered, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Several jury members wiped tears from their eyes, while others stared at him with undisguised disgust. The judge, an older man with silver hair, listened intently. When all testimony concluded, he straightened in his chair and delivered the sentence. "Calvin Briggs, for your crimes against Lena Parker and others, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words rang through the courtroom like a bell, final and absolute. Calvin's shoulders slumped, the last of his arrogance draining away as officers approached to lead him out. Lena stepped down from the witness stand on shaky legs. She walked past Calvin without sparing him a glance, her head held high. In the hallway, Danielle wrapped her in a tight embrace. "You did it," Danielle whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Lena closed her eyes, letting out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for years. "Yeah, I did." The living room glowed with warm lamplight, casting a cozy atmosphere over the gathered family. Colorful streamers hung from the ceiling, and birthday cards lined the mantel. The smell of chocolate cake mixed with the lingering aroma of Tom's famous lasagna. Danielle carefully carried the cake to the coffee table, 22 candles flickering in the dim light. The frosting was slightly messy. She'd insisted on decorating it herself. But the wobbly, "Happy Birthday Lena" written in blue icing made it perfect. "All right, birthday girl, make a wish," Danielle said, grinning as she set the cake down. Lena sat cross-legged on the floor, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. She wore a soft sweater that was actually hers, not borrowed or stolen, and her hair was healthy now, falling in gentle waves around her shoulders. "This is my first real birthday," she said quietly, almost to herself. Tom watched from his favorite armchair, his coffee mug warm in his hands. The scene before him felt surreal, so different from that cold December night when he'd found two tiny babies fighting for life. Now those same girls sat before him whole and healing. Lena closed her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. The room fell quiet except for the soft crackle of candles. "What did you wish for?" Danielle asked, nudging her sister's shoulder playfully. Lena opened her eyes, looking around at the decorated room, at her sister's face, at Tom's gentle smile. "Nothing," she said softly. "I already have everything I need." Tom's throat tightened. 22 years ago, he'd made a promise to two helpless infants. Looking at Lena now, surrounded by love and safety, he knew that promise had finally been fulfilled. Lena leaned forward, took a deep breath, and blew out the candles. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. The grandfather clock's steady ticking echoed through Tom's darkened house, marking time in the dead of night. Outside, winter wind rattled the windows, and bare branches cast dancing shadows on the walls from the dim streetlight. A piercing scream shattered the silence. Lena bolted upright in her bed, her nightshirt soaked with cold sweat. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, eyes wild with terror. Danielle burst through the door seconds later, her footsteps thundering down the hallway. "Lena, it's okay." She rushed to her sister's side, reaching for her trembling hands. Lena shook her head violently, her voice barely a whisper. It felt real. So real. Her fingers clutched the blanket until her knuckles turned white. I was back there, in that room. I could smell it, feel it. Danielle wrapped her arms around her sister, pulling her close. "It's over. He can't hurt you anymore." She stroked Lena's hair, just like when they were kids. "You're safe now." Tears streamed down Lena's face. "Why did I survive? Why didn't I fight harder before?" Her voice cracked with guilt. "I should have been stronger. Should have found a way out sooner." Tom appeared in the doorway, his weathered face etched with concern. He watched silently as Danielle rocked her sister, whispering words of comfort until Lena's sobs quieted to hiccups. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Tom poured 3 cups of coffee. Lena sat at the table, shoulders hunched, dark circles under her eyes. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug but didn't drink. Tom settled into the chair across from her. "Healing isn't a straight line, kid." His voice was gentle but firm. "Some days will be harder than others, but you don't have to fight alone." Lena nodded, but her eyes remained troubled, fixed on the swirling coffee in her cup. The weight of her past still pressed heavily on her shoulders, despite the morning light trying to chase away the shadows of her nightmare. Tom placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You made it out. Now, it's time to live." Warm afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Ridgeport Rehabilitation Center's main hall, casting a gentle glow over the rows of folding chairs. Small bouquets of spring flowers decorated the makeshift stage, and a podium stood ready at its center. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as families and friends gathered for the graduation ceremony. Backstage, Lena's hands trembled as she gripped her carefully written speech. The paper crinkled slightly under her nervous fingers. She wore a simple blue dress, her first new outfit in years, and her hair was neatly styled, though she kept tucking loose strands behind her ear. Danielle stood beside her wearing a proud grin. She gave her sister a playful nudge. "You got this, sis." Her eyes sparkled with joy, seeing how far Lena had come from those dark days in the hospital. In the front row, Tom sat straight-backed in his chair, his weathered face creased with a warm smile. He'd traded his usual casual clothes for a pressed shirt and tie, wanting to mark the occasion properly. His eyes never left the stage entrance, waiting for Lena's moment. The Rehabilitation Center's director, Dr. Sarah Chen, stepped up to the podium. Her voice carried clearly through the hall. "And now, I'd like to call up someone very special. Her journey reminds us why we do this work. Please welcome Lena Parker." Lena took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. Her steps were steady, though her heart raced. She looked out at the audience, other graduates, their families, the staff who had helped her heal. Her gaze found Danielle and Tom in the front row, their presence anchoring her. She placed her speech on the podium, smoothing the paper with slightly shaking hands. For a moment, she just stood there, taking in the scene before her. Then she began to speak, her voice soft but clear. "I am not what happened to me," she said, gaining strength with each word. "I am what I choose to become." In the audience, tears welled up in Danielle's eyes. She reached for a tissue, not bothering to hide her emotion. Beside her, Tom discreetly wiped at his own eyes, his chest swelling with pride. Lena continued speaking, her voice growing more confident. She talked about darkness and light, about falling and rising, about the family that never gave up on her. When she finished, warm applause filled the room. She stepped down from the stage and straight into Danielle's waiting arms. They hugged tightly, sisters reunited not just in body, but in spirit. "I did it," Lena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Danielle pulled back just enough to meet her sister's eyes, smiling through her tears. "I always knew you would." The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the sweet scent of blooming flowers from Tom's small garden. He settled deeper into his weathered porch chair, watching the sky transform from dusky purple to brilliant orange. Steam rose lazily from his coffee mug, swirling in the gentle breeze. Tom's phone buzzed against the wooden railing. He picked it up, expecting another crisis or emergency. Old habits die hard, but when he saw Danielle's name on the screen, he felt oddly calm. "Hello?" His voice was relaxed, matching the peaceful morning around him. "Hey," Danielle's voice came through clear and steady. "Just wanted to check in." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly. "No emergency this time?" A light laugh, something that had once been so rare from Danielle, filtered through the speaker. "Nope, just wanted to talk." Tom took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through his chest. "How's the new apartment?" "Good. Lena's actually cleaning right now. Can you believe it? She's become such a neat freak." "Better than the alternative," Tom chuckled. "True. Oh, and she got that promotion at work. Assistant manager now." Pride swelled in Tom's chest. "That's great news." "What about you? Still planning that fishing trip?" "Yeah, next weekend. Found a nice spot up north." Their conversation meandered through simple topics: the weather, a new restaurant Danielle discovered, Tom's attempt at growing tomatoes. No talk of court dates, no therapy appointments to coordinate, no nightmares to discuss, just life. Tom watched a pair of cardinals hop along his porch railing, their bright red feathers catching the morning light. Danielle told him about a funny thing that happened at work, and her laughter was easy, unburdened. "Well, I should get going," Danielle said eventually. "Just wanted to say hi." Tom smiled, taking another sip of his now lukewarm coffee. "I think I like this new normal." The warmth from the fireplace filled Tom's dining room, mixing with the rich aroma of roasted turkey and freshly baked bread. Golden light from the chandelier cast a gentle glow over the feast spread across the table. Tom stood at the head, carving knife in hand, watching with amusement as Danielle and Lena playfully squabbled. "That's the biggest slice of pumpkin pie and you know it," Danielle pointed accusingly at her sister with her fork. Lena rolled her eyes, but her smile was bright. "I spent 3 hours making those pies. I think I deserve the biggest slice." "Oh, playing the baker card now?" Danielle laughed, reaching across the table to snag the contested piece. Tom couldn't help but notice how different Lena looked now. Her cheeks were fuller, her eyes clear and bright. The haunted expression that had shadowed her face for so long was gone. Working as a youth counselor had given her purpose, helping kids who were just as lost as she once was. "Look at you being all responsible," Danielle teased, nudging her sister's shoulder. "Remember when you used to steal my desserts?" "That was one time," Lena protested, but she was grinning. Tom set down the carving knife and took his seat, soaking in the moment. The house that had been quiet for so many years now rang with laughter and life. Looking at the twins, it was hard to believe how far they'd come. Danielle raised her glass, her expression growing serious for a moment. "To second chances," she announced, "and to the stubborn old man who refused to give up on us." Tom chuckled and shook his head, feeling warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fireplace. "I'd do it all over again." They clinked glasses, the sound mixing with the crackle of the fire and the soft music playing in the background. Lena reached across the table, taking Tom's weathered hand in hers. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I never got to say it before," she said softly. Tom smiled gently. "Say what?" "Thank you," Lena whispered. Tom looked around at his unlikely family, at Danielle stealing another bite of pie, at Lena's gentle smile, at the home that had finally become what he'd always wanted it to be, and felt true peace settle in his heart. If you enjoyed the story of Tom, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.